Now we continue this discussion in the studio. WTIU and WFIU always try to include representation from both sides of the aisle on shows like this. And in preparation for this program, we contacted multiple Republican officials, including two members of the executive branch, 8 House members, 3 state senators, and the party's chairman and deputy chairman, as well as members of their staffs. And for various reasons, none of those people are here tonight. But we are very happy to welcome Monroe County Republican Party Political Director Josh Kelly and Greencastle State Representative Nancy Michael. Welcome to you both, and thank you for being on the show today. We really do appreciate it. Continuing the conversation that Stan and Brian were having in the studio, Nancy, I'd like to start with you and talk about your thought process this recent legislative session when we were thinking about property tax caps and why you voted the way that you voted.
Well, the discussion got really interesting, and it was interesting to me. This was my first time to vote on it. I ended up supporting the vote. And the reason was not because I believed in the policy, but it came down to voters wanting the right to make that decision in November. But I will tell you what went through my mind. As somebody who's been in public service for 21 years, mayor of Greencastle, it is very true that it is local government entities that are really going to suffer from the caps. And what was interesting to me is that while we're talking about capping property taxes, and lots of people have talked about property taxes need to be controlled, we weren't having any kind of conversation about what would we rather use. And it became obvious to me during this session, although in order to make this change in the Constitution, you have to have it pass 2 houses. In this second go-around, there was not a willingness to really have a debate about it, in my opinion. It was already a very foregone conclusion that this was something that a majority of the House and the Senate had voted upon, and they weren't interested in having some other conversation, other dialogue. I won't say that all the members felt that way. And so the bottom line, the end result, the vote ended up coming down for some people. It was something that they had already voted on. And the other issue was for me in my surveys and in the people that were emailing me and talking to me in my district, their direction to me was they wanted to have the right to make that decision in November. And for me, it was about the vote opposed to whether or not it was the right policy. And I think now the onus is upon us to make sure that we educate the people to know what that means.
Okay, well, Stan has a question for you right now. Stan, why don't you go ahead?
Representative Michael, you said that your constituents wanted the right to make this decision, but do you think that the Hoosier populace in general has enough information to intelligently make this decision? Do they know enough about the ramifications of this process and what this could mean going forward for the state financially?
Well, I think in reality, I think there's going to be a lot of education, and I think that the population still needs to get a lot of information. I don't think that today that they're probably as informed about the real effects, because that's what we want to make sure of. We want to make sure that people who make this vote have all the information before them, the data, and what it's going to mean. And in all honesty, to me, I think that a lot of local governments have, you've not seen a loss in services from, I'm going to say, cities and counties, because and libraries, they've always figured out how to do the job. But because there is such a limitation on how much that they can raise, I think that for some reason, you know, there is somewhat of a disconnect between that dollar and those services. But people have to ask themselves all the time, what do I get for the money I pay? And the question is do I pay my fair share? And do I pay more or less than the services and the value of those services? So do I think the voters are ready today? Some are, some aren't. I think it'll be an easy question when they say, do you want to limit your property taxes to 1% on your home, 2% on your farmland, 3% on business? I think a lot of people are going to say yes, but I'm just really hoping that people are really going to stop and think about what it is that pays for and what is it that people are willing to give up, because I think it will change the services.
Josh, you wanted to pipe in on this as well?
Well, I think that you know, voters in Indiana are certainly going to be informed about the upcoming decision. And you know, anybody who's ever had to pay a property tax bill knows exactly what goes into that. And ultimately the question becomes, do we want to give up services? You know, of course there's services there, but what's more important? Being able to pay my bills and keep my house, or being able to have some services that may not actually be needed by every single citizen. So, you know, you talk about what do you get for your money, you know, a bang for your buck type of argument, and I think that people around the state certainly are going to be educated about the fact that, you know, maybe governments around the state, especially at the local unit, need to learn how to tighten their belts when Hoosiers are having to do that everywhere.
Okay, well, let's hear more. Our last stop was in Columbus, Indiana, as Hoosiers express their stance on the property tax caps.
I think the educational system should be funded by a flexible source, which I guess would imply a non-stable source. But it should be a combination of state funding and local community funding. And the local community should have more input as to how much they want to put into their schools.
If you own your land, you own your land, you know. I don't think you ought to have to pay taxes on anything that you've already purchased, in my opinion.
And we're back with Brian Vargas, IUPUI political science professor and longtime political analyst. So give me your impression of this session as a whole. There were not a lot of things that legislators were saying they wanted to do when the session started, and yet there was a fair amount of substantial news that came out of this session.
Well, this was a case of a lot of bang and smoke and fire. But when you actually look at the accomplishments, they're fairly limited, because the simple fact is the state doesn't have any money. The state is broke. Many cities and towns are broke. School districts are basically broke. They're giving millions back. They're laying off teachers. It's all coming home to roost now. So the legislature couldn't do very much. So they talked about ethics. And they even, at the very end, got down to this whole problem of tax for unemployment compensation. And they were very careful not to mention that the state of Indiana, by the next legislative session, will owe the federal government approximately $3 billion to make up for errors in how they've handled and dealing with federal payments and so forth that are required under federal law. And so they couldn't do much. But they were always, they're like flowers in a garden trying to get sunlight, because they all, frankly, are motivated in part, certainly by public service, but also by getting reelected. So they want to see their name.
Speaking of the election, this is obviously an election year, but right now the state still has more than $1 billion in its rainy day fund, which has not been spent yet. But it will probably be spent, most analysts, no matter what political stripe, agree by the next time we have an election in the presidential and the gubernatorial election year in 2012. So I'm wondering if you think that the ramifications of this year's political decisions and, in fact, next year's, when the state could be in even worse financial trouble, won't manifest themselves this November, but more in November of 2012.
Oh, yeah, I definitely think it would be much more likely in 2012. And you saw in some of the interviews with Hoosiers on the street that we played that some people just said, I don't know anything about it, or they haven't made the connection between the delivery of services, as the representative was talking about, said, you know, they need to see what they want to pay for. And I didn't quite understand the gentleman who wanted varying support for education. But the bottom line is, public education is a substantial portion of the budget and the property tax suspense. And the notion that we can compete economically with the rest of the country and get businesses to locate here without a well-educated workforce is absolutely essential for the legislators to understand. And they're going to have to find a way to get the money. And they didn't discuss that, as the representative pointed out. They didn't talk about, are we going to go from a flat income tax to a graduated one? How are we going to do that? Are we going to increase the sales tax again? Where's the money going to come from? If you're going to talk about economic development, about moving Indiana forward, you're going to have the money to pay for it. The budget surplus was created by basically cutting payments to counties, cities, towns, and school districts. The budget was balanced on their backs, and now it's coming home to roost. Whether people want to continue to support public education is an open question, because this is also a state that has a very high median age and has a number of households without any children in it. That's one of the key things that I think will strike home when they see their school district not being able to compete. For example, suppose, dystopia, suppose they decided to simply not allow schools to use any public monies for their basketball program.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but we'll talk about this again, I have a feeling. Brian Vargas is a political science professor at IUPUI. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And back to you in the studio.
All right, thank you both.